spatial patterns of communities. This concern has led them on towards looking at the processes which have helped to shape those patterns. Now, communities are seldom ever static, but they are changing constantly under the impact of economic, political and social forces. Usually change is imperceptible to individuals and they're able to adapt themselves to it. But occasionally the change comes suddenly and the shock is too great for the community to adjust. Where change is very widespread, then attempts by planners to influence its direction by means of the planning process becomes inevitable. In this programme, we're going to look at a mining community area, County Durham, its settlements dispersed across a coalfield. This is an area which has suffered an economic crisis as many of its pits have closed down. And we're going to look first of all at this crisis, but more importantly at the effect it's had on the communities and how they've reacted to it. Before the development of mining, the settlement base of the county was a large number of scattered agricultural villages. Remnants of this type remain virtually unchanged within our study area in central Durham. The long-established village of Het is typical. 2 rows of houses line the large village green, which provided a common pasture for the village animals. Farm buildings form a significant percentage of the settlement. Service cons are often limited to a jail store and post office and a public house. Villages like Het have maintained their rural character, proposed a new settlement pattern. Pit villages were first built on the exposed coal seams in the west and then spread throughout the county. Many of these villages flourished for a short time, then steadily declined. East Howell is one such village. In East Howell, we can trace the entire history of one of these small mining settlements. Originally only the site of an isolated farm, the existence of coal led to the sinking of a colliery in 1872. Here one literally had a pit in the farmyard. Nearby, colliery rows were built to house the workers. Services and facilities in the village were only the basic essentials. A single general store, 2 chapels long since closed, and a public house provided for the miners and their families. All are now disused, and the majority of the colliery houses are now derelict. This is hardly surprising, as the East Howell Colliery closed after a disastrous fire in 1905. Perhaps the surprising aspect of East Howell is that it has survived as a village for so long. The pit and its associated coke ovens had supported the people for barely a generation. Despite the loss of its economic base, the settlement itself was to survive for very much longer. Even today we can distinguish the main features of the village. A series of maps traces the history of East Howell. By 1897, the village had reached its maximum extent. The dark buildings around the railway sidings represent the industrial buildings of the pit and coke ovens, while the lighter rows represent the housing. By 1920, the pit and all its buildings had been cleared away. The housing, however, remained intact. Indeed, it was to remain like this for over 40 years. As late as 1961, the plan of the village had hardly altered. It was not until the late 1960s that change came about. By 1970, a good deal of the old colliery rows had been demolished. Soon, after a century of growth and decline, East Howell will revert to being merely an isolated farm. The era of extensive small-scale mining in County Durham is now over. The villages which were a product of this activity still remain, but their future is a doubtful one. In the case of East Howell, the future is demolition.
So the only reason for the existence of East Howell was the colliery. Now this colliery closed nearly 70 years ago, and yet, as we've seen, there are still a few terraces left here. But they won't be there for much longer, because this village, like many others in the county, is being gradually cleared away.
What has been the history of East Howell could well be the future for many larger communities in County Durham. Since the war, there has been an increasing rate of pit closures. In 1951, the Durham field employed over 100,000 men in 120 pits. During the 1950s, the coal field contracted. 11 pits closed, and by 1961, the manpower had declined to 87,000. But it was during the 1960s that the Coal Board's accelerated pit closure program left only 34 pits working, employing 34,000 men. Mr. Atkinson of the National Coal Board explains the reasons behind the closures.
There have been a great many changes in the Durham coal field. We've had closures for several reasons affecting mainly the west of the county, to some extent the central part of the county, as the coal field concentrates on the large reserves of coal available to us from the coast. But in recent years there have been other factors affecting the industry. Apart from closures due to natural exhaustion of reserves, we've had market changes, we've had the effects of government fuel policy, and the effect of certain internal changes within the industry.
Closure on a scale such as this represents not merely the loss of livelihood to individual families, but the complete collapse of the economic framework of communities. Derek Senior, himself a geographer and planner, has described the change in this fashion. Change becomes a serious problem only when it means that men in the prime of their working life have no choice but to take jobs far from their homes, when houses stand empty and property values fall, when trade dwindles, rate revenues shrink, and local needs can no longer be met from local resources. Then social services fail to keep pace with rising standards, private enterprise flags, bus services are cut, the buildings still in use become obsolete and dilapidated, and abandoned ones lie derelict. Ferry Hill Station is one village in our study area affected by these more recent closures. Ferry Hill Station in Chiltern Lane, a community just to the south of the larger centre of Ferry Hill, is a good example of one of these communities that's been affected by this rapid change. This community has long had various pits in it, but the main source of employment was the Mainsforth colliery on the other side of the main railway line from London to Edinburgh. Here again, we have the familiar situation of a village almost completely dependent on the colliery. In this case, closure was unforeseen, as Mr. Atkinson explains.
Mainsforth closed for a unique reason. The pit was flooded out. This was not a question of exhaustion of reserves or economics or anything like that. In fact, the pit was working quite well. We were happy with it, and it would have been working today, except that we encountered a feeder of water from the strata overlying the coal seams. This was quite unpredictable. Unfortunately, it flooded the last remaining reserves in the richest coal seam, the Low Main, and this meant that we had to abandon the colliery completely.
Whatever the actual reason for the closure of Mainsforth, it is the profound social consequences we are concerned with. The closure of the pit hastened the process of transition in the traditional way of life of the village. The traditional way of life springs from ties of kinship, occupation, and residence in the same place over a long period. The older miners in particular, many of them prematurely retired, have tried to maintain their customary routine. What were once only their pastimes have now become their sole occupation. Pigeon racing has long been popular in mining areas, and above the village, colourful pigeon lofts are as familiar a Durham sight as the pit bank itself. Brass bands are another feature of the traditional way of life. On the coal fields, they amount almost to an institution.
was once the Mainsforth Colliery Band, and it was made up entirely of miners, some of whom still remain. But now its membership is much wider. Survival depends on the local youngsters. What are the effects of a pit closure on a community such as this? The most immediate ones are economic. Often these villages have no other major source of employment. There is a high risk of unemployment unless the men can find work elsewhere. Those that do find work may have to travel considerable distances. Mr. Atkinson outlines the consequences of the Mainsforth closure for the miners of Ferry Hill Station.
At the time of the Mainsforth closure, we employed almost 1,000 men. We were able to offer jobs for almost 500 of that 1,000. In the event, slightly more than 100 refused our offers, so that we redeployed to other collieries, the long light collieries on the coast, mainly Bain Tempest and Black Hole. We employed rather less than 400. Nearly 500 were made redundant by us, declared redundant. These were older men. We get men to other collieries to work by laying on special bus services for them. One of the problems about this, of course, is the time spent in the journey. You'll understand that men who've lived in the village across the railway line there and had a fairly short walk to work, when they are faced with a journey of perhaps 40-45 minutes, they don't like this. And presumably, it was this travelling time that was a major factor in more than 100 men refusing the offers which we made.
Tommy Foster was one of the miners made redundant.
Oh yes, the young miners, a lot went to the factories, mind. A lot went to the factories. Some of them's gone to the pits. We could have gone to the pits. We're at our age, we didn't want to travel really. Not to Jordan, Hazelton, Bain Tempest, I think it was. Maybe another one. Black Hall, yes. Well, I worked at the pit in this particular pit, 42 years. It hasn't been right round. I can't get a job. The only job I ever got the chance of was night watchman.
But what are the implications for the village as a whole?
Well, it was death to the village. There's nothing here, you know. I mean, the stores is gone. We only have little corner shops. That's all we've got. We haven't got a big shop.
I found that a lot of people wanted to stay in Ferry Hill Station, but have had to move because they've had to move where the factories have gone to expand more, and they would have liked to have stayed in Ferry Hill. Probably as a new road, it's made a lot of difference to him because he's had a lot of houses knocked down about him.
Since Mainsforth Colliery closed down, and one or two more collieries around this district, Ferry Hill is flat. And how long it's going to last that way, I do not know.
But I mean, I started the colliery, I've been here all my life as well. And I started all down when I was 14. I finished when the pit was, I was redundant, like.
But I think we're getting off to being subject to what's happened to the village. There's a lot of it since the will it be? Yeah. There's a lot of young lads living in the village today, they won't have work. I know, but look at these houses they're demolishing, the front rows, the Mainsforth rows. They're not building again. No. It's only recently, I don't know whether it's been a day village of category of four, but it's only lately that I knew it was a day village when it first come off there. But it was a day village.
But more important for the future of the village are the prospects of the young people. Mainsforth closed at the beginning of their working lives.
I'd like a very, job I'm really safe and, the rest of my life. But nowadays, there's not much work on it, so I can make it finished anytime,
Well, when I first got stone, I started at Mainsforth Colliery, and I was a timber later down there for 2 years until the water broke in at Mainsforth. They had to close, and I was offered another job
4 different collieries in Easington, then Tempest. Horton, which wasn't to my satisfactory. I wanted to go somewhere near his home, more like Fishburn. So consequently I turned it down and wouldn't be transferred. And I was made redundant, and from there I went to the factory at 3 M's, which I worked on export, which I am still there working.
I worked as factory at Bengal or the employed in the store. I've been there since I left school. I'm trying for another job in the area. Nothing at the moment.
Despite the insecurity, these local lads show surprising loyalty to the area. Would they want to move away?
I don't know. I'll do on the next thing.
I think I'd stop where I was at now. Used to this place. I don't think I'd move away and start, find new friends and everything again. I'm happy as I am now.
No, I wouldn't move away neither.